Today I was on the Republic Broadcasting Network radio, filling in for Michael Herzog for a couple of hours. And I'm always cautious as to how I phrase things to an American public who are used to hearing traditional solutions to all of these problems. The traditional solutions is always stuck in the framework that you have rights and that they have a constitution and so on. They don't realize it's been thrown out of the window a long time ago. Long time ago. If they can get past that stage, I know they can start taking proper steps, including the realization that they are in an intergenerational battle, and that it's their children who are currently being brainwashed, and that they must start communicating deeply and quickly for the first time. Unfortunately, there's not enough of the older people, the grandparents involved in the families anymore to give them their histories, their recent histories, which they must know. Because the United States was not, as I say, an Andy of Maybury society. People don't even know of the turmoil within the United States right up into the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s. They don't know that across the United States, lots and lots of people lived in factory towns, a system developed in Europe and in England, where the owner of the factory, owned the town, and the employees rented from their boss. And the boss also owned the stores in town, the pharmacy in town. He owned the doctor that you hired. He owned the minister who gave you your sermons and told you to be good and obey the rules. And the people were kept in a state of poverty. They couldn't save up. That's why the unions came into being in the United States. They were basically owned in a system that was feudal, a system that went back through Europe for centuries. The same system that still existed in Britain when I grew up, in many parts of the country of the UK. It was the same system going back to Thomas Malthus from the 1700s. They could keep the average family, that it all worked out mathematically, how much you earned, how much you paid out, what nutritional value you would take in according to what they'd allow you to afford. Would you be strong enough to cause trouble? Would you be strong enough to think very clearly? And so you were kept almost in a malnourished state. Food has always been used as a weapon, going all the way back to Sumer and Egypt and upwards to the present time. As it still is, in fact, because they've already started the war long ago on your food when they first denaturalized it. Healthy mind, healthy body. You need both. Look at people around you today and the obesity you will see. That's the result of malnourishment. They have lots of calories, but the nourishment isn't there. The bodies that they have are craving something which they're not getting from the foods they eat. And that's planned too. Again, read Thomas Malthus and his essays on population. He's talking about population control. Well, on RBN I mentioned how these large dynasties, these big family dynasties who hold tremendous wealth and power, rise up. And the reality behind them, these monsters that we now call benefactors and philanthropists and who hire all their front NGO leaders who speak for us and decide what direction they choose to take us. And that's what they call the new democracy. The Soviet system is well alive, and it's kicking, and it's here, and it's worldwide now. These NGOs work at the top. A lot of the followers don't know it, but the ones at the top do. They work for the big boys. Now, I don't get paid, by the way, for these radio shows I'm on. I've never had payment from any show or television show that I've been on. Just to let you know. Here's a little bit about the Rockefellers, these great philanthropists who are interwoven with CIA. They give out Citizenship of the World awards to most of the famous people you see on television. They all have awards from them. The ones who pretend to lead your nation for the nation. This book is The Rockefellers, an American Dynasty by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. Published by Holt, Reinhardt, Winston. Well worth reading. It talks about old man Rockefeller in the early 1900s who'd accumulated massive amounts of money in the oil and coal and iron industries, all the mineral sources and resources. The same thing as Cecil Rhodes and his groups were doing on behalf of London across Africa. They had their own boys in the United States doing the same thing, who belonged to the same club, by the way. One of his companies was called the Colorado Fuel and Iron. They had factories and mines also in Pennsylvania. Here's what it said on page 111. The United Miners Workers Union had complained about the measly conditions they had, terrible conditions. There were deaths every day, and they were paid pittances for themselves and their families. And this happened in many towns across the United States. One of them was called Ludlow. They settled into tent colonies. This is what the miners did. They settled in tent colonies the United Miners Workers Union had set up for them near the small, nearby anonymous mining towns of the area. One of them was named Ludlow. This is 23rd of September 1913. What previously had been regarded as isolated incidents between the detectives, because you see they brought in detectives and private armies on behalf of Rockefeller and the group. It says here, and miners now turned into military skirmishes. One of the most serious occurred on October 17th, when the Baldwin Felts men, these are private strikebreakers, agencies. That's why I always tell people to beware of private armies, and we know about the big private army that's being formed right now, don't we? The Baldwin Felts men piled in the armoured car the miners called the Death Special, and they raced through the tent colony near Forbes, raking the area with fire from 2 mounted machine guns, and then speeding off into the dusk. The miners retaliated as best they could, and 2 weeks later Colorado's Governor Ammons finally called out the National Guard in an attempt to restore the peace. For a time the militiamen tried to enforce the Colorado law that forbade bringing scabs into an area where there was a labor dispute. But in the bitter winter months ahead, the state found itself unable to meet the militia's payroll without help from the business interests. The Guard became openly partisan, in other words, were paid off, escorting into the coal fields strikebreakers who had been imported by rail from as far away as Pittsburgh and Toledo. Then in late February, with the state treasury depleted, Governor Ammons, A-M-M-A-M-M-O-N-S, Ammons, as in Ammon-Ra. What a coincidence, eh? They pulled out all but a few strategically stationed units. Most of the militiamen who remained were openly antagonistic to the strikers. On the morning of April the 20th, the labour war that had thus far cost dozens of lives came to its bloody climax. A company of militia that had repeatedly clashed with the strikers took up a position on a rise overlooking the tents of Ludlow. The chill wind whipped up at laundry, drying stiffly on the clotheslines, and curled the smoke climbing out of stove pipes poked through the tent tops. The strikers stared suspiciously at the men above them. Then just after daybreak, a shot rang out from an unknown source, and the jittery militiamen responded by opening fire from their Hotchkiss guns, beginning a battle that would last all day. As their tents, punctured with bullets, caught fire, the strikers retreated to positions in cellars dug under the floorboards. By nightfall, the scene was one of complete devastation. There were 40 dead and countless wounded, but the worst was to come, for next morning, as the people of Ludlow emerged from underground and walked through the smouldering colony counting their losses, they discovered the bodies of 2 women and 11 children who had suffocated in a cellar when the tent above them had burned. The outrage had found its symbol, and as news of it spread, other colonies of strikers began an offensive against the mine operators, seizing towns and attacking company outposts within a 250-mile radius of Ludlow. President Woodrow Wilson ordered federal troops into the area to end what threatened to become an all-out war. That type of thing was going on in Andy of Maybury, you see. That was really what was happening in the very beginning of the 1900s, and had already been happening through the 1800s as well. Hollywood did a great job of convincing everyone there was nothing happening except cowboys and Indians. Industry had been there for a long time, and the big magnates had been in power for a long time. You should find out too how the big boys accumulated their wealth and their oil, because nothing was too dirty for them to do, including burning out any competition, including their oil wells when necessary in order to take them over. But the greatest thing of all is how you're told in books like these how the PR men were brought in to change the image of a monster into a philanthropist who cared about the world and would donate money to good causes of his own choosing and sometimes of his own making, because they guide the world. From both sides, the rod and the staff, you see, must be used to guide the people. Now, with the takedown of the old Soviet system as it expands and merges with the capitalist system, as it was always meant to do, those rights, through unions, and individual rights too that came with them, are being taken away again, because you don't have to be pampered anymore. You don't have to be conned anymore and babied by people who despise you. Now you are seeing their true face once more. A face that's been seen down through the ages, the tyrant's face, the arrogant one, who is very blatant in his arrogance. They all look the same in all ages. Their comments are all the same in all ages. The media is there, of course, to smooth out their statements for us, to make them more palatable, or to rephrase them in fuzzy, nice ways, so that we don't get the right impression. That's the world we live in. Really nasty, and it's going to get a lot worse, because we are the commoners. The commoners whose job now is over, almost, when they bring about this new efficient society. No one will be allowed to exist without a purpose in this new society, this wonderful new world order that's been on the go for a long time. This long-range business plan, which always has said that the public are there to serve the system. and not the system to serve the public. It's no secret that all NATO countries have prepared and signed agreements to deal with massive rioting in all of their countries, which they have predicted are going to come along. And yet Joe Average that watches TV with his wife, who watches the soaps and he's watching the sports, will go to the very end not knowing that in reality they're the enemy. And when you sit back watching people across the world being blown up and killed and butchered by your own sons and daughters, funded by your own tax money, why on earth do you think it eventually won't come round and eat you, because the monster that starts off this way becomes hungrier all the time? And it doesn't distinguish one peasant in one country to a peasant in another. What goes around comes around. As you sow, so shall you reap. And if you don't cry out for the injustices in the world for others, there's going to be no one to cry out for you. This strict regime of being told what you're to do through all the scientific experts and societies and agencies is being stepped up. Stepped up big time. We've had wars on everything: poverty, smoking, the drugs increase. Now they're going for a war on obesity. I mentioned this a few years ago, that the United Nations would then turn to that. They make the people malnourished. They encourage the culture that feeds them all the fast foods, because they had to get fast foods to get mum and dad out working. They couldn't have one at home cooking anymore. They wanted them both out there consuming and producing, and doubling the tax base, plus separating themselves from the children. But don't worry, television was taking care of them. The result, of course, we see all around us of malnourished people who are very fat but can't stop eating. Now, sure enough, along it comes. An article by Peter Griffiths from Thursday, July the 12th. London routers, or some people say Reuters. It says, a fat tax on salty, sugary and fatty foods could save thousands of lives each year, according to a study published on Thursday. A study. I love how they phrase things. Researchers at Oxford University say that changing value-added tax. See, they've had value-added tax in Britain since about the 70s, the early 70s. VAT, they call it. It was supposed to come out on luxury goods only initially, but only a few idiots believed that. It spread to everything else. And the value-added tax is going to start at 17.5% on foods deemed to be unhealthy and would cut consumer demand and reduce the number of heart attacks and strokes, because they care about you. That's why they made you fat in the first place and malnourished you and gave you inoculations and fluoride and altered all the food that you eat through big organizations working with your governments. So here's your benefactors back at it again. The purchase tax is already levied on a small number of products such as potato crisps, ice cream, confectionery and chocolate biscuits. But most food is exempt, well, see, at the moment. At the moment. The move could save, I love how they get these statistics. They probably built a computer to give them this one. The move could save an estimated 3,200 lives in Britain each year, according to the study in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. A well-designed, carefully targeted fat tax could be a useful tool for reducing the burden of food-related disease, the study concluded. The team from Oxford Department of Public Health said higher taxes have already been imposed on cigarettes and alcohol to encourage healthy living and misery. I added the last part there. You see, without any fun, Jack becomes a dull boy. They used a mathematical formula to estimate the effect of higher prices on the demand for foods such as pastries, cakes, cheese and butter. However, they said the research only gave a rough guide to the number of lives that could be saved, and said more work was needed to get an exact picture of how taxes could improve public health. See, taxes are good for you. Taxes are healthy. Any fat tax might be seen as an attack on personal freedom and would weigh more heavily, look at the pun, on poorer families, the study warned. That's typically Oxford. A food tax would raise average weekly household bills by 4.6% or 67 pence per person. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair has previously rejected the idea as an example of the nanny state that might push people away from healthy food. Well, where do you find the healthy food now, Mr. Blair? This is the guy that brought in the genetically modified food and made it law. The Food and Drink Federation has called the proposed tax patronising and says it would hit low-income families hardest. Boy, I love all these federations and think tanks who get paid to do these studies. I mean, you have to be a genius to come up with that. The Food and Drink Federation has called the proposed tax patronising, says it would hit low-income families. I wonder how much you got paid to figure that out. It suggests that people eat a balanced diet. Balanced diet. The British Heart Foundation says it does not support the tax. We believe the government should focus on ensuring healthy foods are financially and geographically accessible to everyone, it said, because I always give you the dialectic, you see. And yeah, here we go. And you see, this is all part of bringing you in. They want to psychologically evaluate every child, to begin with all children's schools, every year. And then to continue, when you're used to it, you continue all through your life to make sure that you're dumbed down enough to stay in their workforce. You've passed their quality approval standards of being pretty dumb. And they want to do the same thing with your health. Watching you, weighing you, measuring you from birth to death. This is the scientific era. Science is a new god. And because science has thrown the god out, you see, then you're going to be much, much worse in an atheistic system than any religious system was before, and they were bad enough. The new religion doesn't have any empathy in it whatsoever. There's no humanity or empathy in science. It's supposedly run on hard facts which alter all the time. So that's where they're going with their food too. It's just totalitarianism and tyranny by quacks, really. Lots of quacks. And really to get you all used to the idea, a generation growing up, living under terrorism, living and seeing black-clad ninja outfits on every street corner with machine guns, and the creation of the apathy that being measured and weighed and having your mind examined every year will cause is to dehumanize every ordinary person on the planet. Dehumanization causes tremendous apathy. This is the purpose of all of this. You see, all this stuff is nonsense. As I say, they cause the problems, then they come up supposedly with their solutions because the problems are evident. The causes of the problems are not evident to the people, usually, who don't think very far. They believe everything the television tells them. So, get used to it as they go. This is all from the United Nations, by the way. The real boss. They come up with all this stuff and they get the governments to sign these agreements. Then the governments to simply implement it automatically into law. It's the same with all the building codes worldwide. They all come from the United Nations and are all designed eventually so you can't keep up with all the standards which are constantly going up until you're broke and you're off what used to be your property. And they'll get you off one way or another. They'll either fine you off because you can't comply or tax you off when you try to comply. The end of private property is to be part of their goal, one of their milestones. Now, I'd also look into the articles that Mark Bard does in his parallelnormal.com. He is a professional journalist, he teaches journalism, and he tries to present the facts without the spin. And that's a rare thing in this day and age, where people are worried about losing their jobs, their standards of income. And that also leads to the dissolution of the family, because those under financial stress or the threat of losing work will have strife at home. That's the way it is. That's how beautiful this system is for the big boys. They have everyone under their thumb through fear and threat of nasty outcomes. In a system of money, no one really feels secure at the bottom, and that's the majority of the public. It's not meant that you feel secure. It's designed to keep you always on edge. They've never given us a system in a monetary system where there's stability for any length of time to give you that feeling of security. When you feel secure, you start getting ideas like, I've got rights, and when you start to push certain laws through, you say, hey, you can't do that to me. And you like stand up for yourself. You get used to being in the same pasture and the grass is green. So they can't have that. They must have you always off balance with wars, rumors of cometal impacts, meteorites, earthquakes, pestilence, famine, and all the rest of it, or wars abroad. That's the old trick, is to keep you always on edge. And when you're on edge all the time, you start to believe the guys that you think might be telling the truth, the big boys who tell you all this information. Maybe they're right. You'll never really be sure, you see, because the abused turns to the abuser for help. Very old system. It's an abusive system. It's anti-human. The ordinary people never win in this system. It's not meant that you win. And when you're offered a hand of help by the big boys, you better run. Because believe you me, they might give you a good reason. You might want to believe it, but there will be behind it all a very good reason, the real reason. And you won't be told the real reason till you see it turn into a fist. We are trained from cradle to grave with a very advanced system of scientific indoctrination via television, cartoons even, right through to movies, predictive programming, getting us ready for the next step and the next step and the next step. Our conclusions are predetermined. We must come to their conclusions the way it's formulated and set out for us to follow. That's how opinions are made by the public. They simply adopt them from their favorite talking head on the media or in a television debate. I always remember what Professor Carl Quigley said in the book Tragedy and Hope, and his other one, The Anglo-American Establishment, concerning this dominant minority that really runs the world, with all of its helping agencies, this capstone that had all these agencies beneath it, like the pyramid, each specialized in one form or another of social control and financial control and the control of all resources and necessities of life. And he said that we, the Council on Foreign Relations, the American branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, he said we don't mind negotiating and working with communists, capitalist dictators, etc., and quite frequently do. Well, of course they did, because they created all of these sides, you see. Long ago they planned the strategy, the dialectic of the creation of opposites to force the herds of the people of the world into a certain path where they merge together into this new system, the third way of Plato. And the big philanthropic organizations, the big foundations, are the driving forces, because technically they're not governmental, but they influence everything within your lives. And the governments obey them because the foundations fund the NGOs that demand certain laws and rules and regulations to save the earth or to save something. There is a book out called Trading with the Enemy, a very good book, worth getting, an exposé of the Nazi American money plot 1933 to 1949. It's published by De La Corte Press, New York. The ISBN number is 0440-09064-4. And it's one of many books that have documented the big boys behind all of the financing and the munitions building and the armaments of countries. And believe you me, you see, it's not what you think it is. It's not the Christians or Jews or even Nazis, really. It's a psychopaths within all groups that know that they're a big club, a club of psychopaths who work together to fool all peoples. A write-up on this book says, for almost 40 years the facts behind the extraordinary true story of Nazi American wartime business relations have been buried in government files. And at last Charles Higham, Higham, drawing his account from thousands of documents just released under the Freedom of Information Act. It took a long time to release them, always about 50 years or 60, has given us a full-scale picture of the American businessmen who dealt with the Nazis right through World War II. Among those who traded on both sides of the war were certain executives of Standard Oil, that's Rockefeller, of New Jersey, the Chase Bank, part of the Federal Reserve, the Texas company, IT&T, Ford, and Sterling Products. They missed out a few here, there's not GM. And helping them with their dealings were such government officials as a Secretary of Commerce, an Assistant Secretary of State, and ambassadors to France and Great Britain. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, was Nazi-controlled, but presided over by an American, even in 1944. At one of its yearly meetings, the bank's president sat down with his German, Japanese, Italian, British, and American executive staff to discuss shipments of $378 million in gold sent to the bank by the Nazi government for use by its leaders after the war. This was gold looted from the banks of Austria, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, or melted down from teeth filings, eyeglass frames, and wedding rings of murdered Jews. And I should add gypsies, because I keep missing them. But that is only one of the stories. Standard Oil of New Jersey executives shipped the Nazis oil through Switzerland, while Allied forces endured restrictions of supplies and shortages abounded. Ford Motor Company trucks were built for Nazi troops with authorization from Ford directors in the U.S. The chairman of ITT supplied much of Hitler's communication systems. The list of those who chose business as usual, even when the business was with their country's enemy, is long and shocking. Charles Higham, biographer and former New York Times writer, presents a meticulously documented, dispassionately told, behind-the-scenes picture of American involvement with the Nazis before, during, and after World War II. And that's one of many books on this. One of the better ones, too, I've read, is to do with the front shell company called I.G. Farben. A book called The Crimes and Punishment of I.G. Farben is well worth reading, because it goes into all of this too, how all the big boys in England, the United States, and other warring countries got together to create this umbrella, which really was the war machine behind Nazism. A phenomenal story, and how during the Nuremberg trials, IG Farben still retained its name as a shell group, comprising all of these particular companies I've mentioned and a lot more, including Baxter Laboratories, which still gives inoculations and makes inoculations for people, someone you can really trust. They sent over representatives, massive, big time lawyers from the US to try and sway the investigation away from too much inquiry into IG Farben and the companies and the shareholders and the names of those involved. And yes, there were all people from all nationalities, all religions involved in it, including Jews. Something that should be looked at very carefully by Jewish groups. And those who follow the big foundations should definitely look into who these great benefactors are. All it is, as I say, is a PR job written by professional experts to give you a false impression of these people, because they're dynasties of psychopathic monsters. And war is business to them. In any shape or form, it's a business. And they have incredible arrogance and incredible lack. In fact, there is no empathy at all in them. There's no shame, guilt. It doesn't exist. And these characters still run the world today. You know, Nazism has been decried and decried as though it was the only crime on the planet for so long. And yet Nazism, as the people generally know it, is only the outer shell of something much higher. Because in its higher form, it was not a German concept. It wasn't meant to simply be a local national thing. It was a world type of concept of evolution, of the Superman. The same philosophy, exact same philosophy as those in the big foundations and their families believed in. And it's still going on well, and it's alive. It was a philosophy of perfecting humanity through special breeding and science. Now we have genetic engineering, and you wonder who has been paying all the money into the genetic research. Do your homework. I hope by now, when you find the answers, you will not be surprised. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's yeah. That's the bottom line, and that's where we are in the world today. Rapidly coming to the end of the roller coaster ride of the age of Pisces into Aquarius, where a utopia is to be born, but only for an elite. The utopia will exist when their problems, the biggest problem they have, the masses, are either non-existent, vastly reduced, but definitely when they have no minds of their own to think with, because the greatest resistance they've ever had down through the ages comes from an idea that comes from a mind. They hope to extinguish the possibility of that ever happening again. And if we sit back and be so darned passive and apathetic, then it's game over, and stop thinking about yourselves too. This is a battle where you'll at least do something for all those who lived before and didn't know either what they were living through. But mainly it's for those to come. In fact, those are the only ones you're fighting for now. Those to come, who will have the rights and the ability to think independently and to experience all there is to be as a human being, with all of its good times and its bad times, its sorrows, its loves, its hates, its rejections, its acceptances, its sunny days and its rainy days. That is the right to experience that. Regardless of what monsters like Aldous Huxley say, that, well, most people aren't happy anyway, what's wrong with giving them a false reality? In other words, a programmed reality. They see nothing wrong with that. You know, in ancient times, in early Christianity, the Gnostics, the early Gnostics, not the later ones, but early ones, at least, they took into the equation the probability of evil consequences and what the nature of evil was. Then when it migrated into the Roman Church, the universal church, they did away with that questioning into the whole nature of evil. And that was the beginning of its downfall, because evil has to be questioned. And it starts with questioning oneself. Science, as I say, will be a cruel master. It already is. And the trick it uses is to convince the people that it masters that you are nothing, that you're not special, that there's no divinity in you, there's no holiness in you, there's no spirit. You are simply a machine. And it's done a great job of propaganda and indoctrination over the last 100, but mainly 50 years, of convincing the public that that is so. The trick they use is to convince you first. And once you believe it yourself, you have already acquiesced to that which will be done upon you. It's time to stop. From Hamish and myself, it's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you.